On this episode of Doing the Most, we're going to talk about how to scale up from 1 gallon to 5 gallon batches. So I started out my homebrewing adventure in 5 and 6 gallon batches because 14 years ago, that's what was common. That's what all the recipes were written for. That's what everyone was brewing. It was just commonplace to start with 5 gallon and higher batches. Now, everywhere on the internet, everyone is teaching you that 1 gallon batches are the best way to get started, and obviously I disagree with that. However, that's where all the gear is scaled to these days. You've got 1 gallon carboys that are super common, 1 gallon auto siphons are everywhere, and it is starting to become the norm to begin homebrewing at a very, very small, what I would call a micro scale of homebrewing. And so when I wrote my ebook, You Can Make Mead, I decided to format all of my recipes around 1 gallon batches because I figured that's what folks were going to be the most comfortable with, and that's where the approachable beginner brewing kits start out at, right? Sure. However, for example, my local homebrew shop sells a full-scale wine kit for beginners that is scaled to 6 gallon batches, and it's comparably priced to most wine kits that you would get on the market from other vendors. So it is possible to start out brewing 5 and 6 gallon batches on a pretty inexpensive budget. Primarily on my Discord server, but in email and Instagram messages and stuff too, I see a lot of folks asking questions about, well, okay, I started out at 1 gallon, now I want to scale up. What should I do? And so I thought maybe now is the appropriate time to make a video on how to scale up from 1 gallon to 5 gallon batches. And first, I'd like to talk about some of the concerns folks have. The biggest concern, obviously, is expense. And as I said earlier, you can find inexpensive beginner kits that are for a larger scale. But there's also concerns around the expense of ingredients, like if you're making mead, honey, or if you're making cider, buying 5 times as much cider as you would making a 5 gallon batch versus a 1 gallon batch. But apple juice does tend to go on sale pretty often, actually relatively seasonally. This video is coming out in January of 2024. I expect around this time, maybe into February, apple juice will start going on sale because people won't be buying it to heat up and mull and make non-alcoholic cider for the holidays. You can generally find it for about half price in January and February here in the States and brew a giant batch of cider for not too much cash. A beer is a great example of a homebrewed beverage that is about as expensive and time-consuming to make on a 5 gallon scale versus a 1 gallon scale, because the cost of grain is pretty negligible and it takes about the same amount of time to brew a 1 gallon batch that it does a 5 gallon batch. I would say beer is probably the cheapest thing ingredients-wise to scale up from 1 to 5 gallons. There's also something called chaptalization, and that's the practice of adding additional fermentable sugar to something to increase the alcohol by volume while keeping the cost pretty minimal. Say, for example, you're making 5 gallons of Concord grape wine, just regular grocery store grape juice. You can add a few pounds of granulated sugar to that for not too much extra cost, a few bucks, and increase the alcohol by volume considerably, so you're still able to brew a big batch of wine relatively cheaply, comparably, and get that ABV up to something that is pretty respectable. For me, generally, when I'm making a cider, a beer, or a wine, I'm not seeing a huge added expense jumping from 1 gallon versus 5 gallons. Yes, you're buying 5 times the amount of ingredients, but generally we're working with relatively inexpensive ingredients. Just look at the price of a 1 gallon wine kit, for example, versus the price of a wine kit made to make 5 or 6 gallons of wine. It's not too far off given the jump in volume. And back to our beer example, here's what it would cost to make 1 gallon of this beer or 5 gallons of the same beer. So in making that beer, considering it's going to take about 3.5 to 4 hours, whether you're making 1 gallon or 5 gallons, the added expense is actually kind of negligible considering the outcome. Other than for making mead, I don't believe the expense of ingredients is a huge hurdle for scaling from 1 to 5 gallons. However, you would need to replace your gear, and we'll get to gear in just a minute. I do want to talk about another concern, which is bulk. 5-gallon batches weigh a lot, and you can mitigate some of that by brewing in 5-gallon buckets, and that is a lot easier to carry than a 5-gallon carboy. Carboy is pretty dangerous to be carrying at full volume, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but it is a concern. There is a lot of bulk involved in 5 gallons of liquid. And also, there's just the amount of final product that you're gonna have. A lot of people are like, what am I gonna do with 24 bottles of wine or 50 bottles of beer? That's just so much. Well, for one, it's really nice to be able to put some back to age. For two, free alcohol makes a great gift for any occasion. So generally, I can find a home for 5 gallons worth of product, especially if it's pretty good stuff, pretty quickly if I don't think I can consume it by myself. So let's talk about gear. You are gonna have to replace some of your gear, specifically your brewing vessels and whatever system you're using to rack, whether it's a racking cane or a full auto siphon. Those are things you are going to have to replace, and that does kind of suck to have to completely swap out all of your gear for new gear. But the tubing for your racking system, all your airlocks, and even those 5-gram packs of yeast you're buying, all that works just fine at a 5-gallon scale. And you've got those 1-gallon jugs, right? Keep them around. They're great for experiments. Maybe you want to make a traditional mead and then split out all 5 gallons into 5 individual 1-gallon batches to add different flavors or fruits or spices to. It's great to be able to take that 5-gallon, that big batch, make it all at once, and then split it down to experiment with in secondary. Like I said, with 5-gallon carboys specifically, glass carboys, they are dangerous to move. It's important to keep them in milk crates, maybe put them on wheels. Sometimes I will keep my carboys on towels if I think I'm gonna need to move them, because I can just very gently drag the towel around on my wood floors and move it without even having to pick the carboy up. That's super nice. It is a concern, and it's probably the primary concern that I have with somebody working in the 5-gallon space, and that's just because glass is so dangerous. I've got a whole video on why 5-gallon glass carboys can be dangerous, and I would just recommend using a lot of caution. Maybe if you're really put off by 5-gallon glass, look at some of the plastic fermenters that are made to reduce headspace in the same way that a glass carboy would. But it is a really valid concern, and one that I am cognizant of anytime I am moving a full 5-gallon carboy. Now, the other thing people get concerned about is recipe conversions. Say they have made something at 1 gallon and they love it. There's a lot of anxiety sometimes about scaling that recipe up to 5 gallons. Unfortunately, on the homebrew scale, going from 1 to 5 gallons is not a huge leap, and most recipes are going to be scalable linearly. So you just take everything but the yeast and multiply by 5. So say you're making a cider and you've got a recipe that outlines how many apples, how much apple juice, how much sugar for chaptalization, how much nutrient, how much acid, all of that, just multiply it by 5 and you've got your 1-gallon recipe converted to a 5-gallon recipe. Really, I don't think there's a lot of merit to that concern at all. Scaling recipes is super simple. And honestly, if you're making something like a beer, I think it's easier to brew a 5-gallon batch of beer than a 1-gallon batch. It's just working on a stove and in like small quantities with way boil off and evaporation works. I'd much prefer to work with a larger volume when I'm dealing with beer. The last concern I see a lot is packaging, and this is one I completely agree with. Bottling a 5-gallon batch sucks. I hate it. I hate investing in all the corks. I hate doing all of the capping. If I'm doing like crown cap bottles, it's killer on my old man knees and it sucks. So I get that, but it's, you know, the cost of the hobby, unfortunately. And it's just one of those things where, yeah, it's super easy to bottle 4 bottles of wine out of a 1-gallon batch, but if you can budget out the time, get some knee pads for your knees, and bottle 5 gallons of wine, you know, you get 24 bottles, the payoff is that you don't have to do bottling for a lot longer between batches because it's all taken care of, right? You've got you've got enough wine essentially for a year out of one batch for most people's consumption. And so it's like a cost benefit analysis, right? Sure, 1 gallon is easy, but bottling 5 gallons saves you a lot of headache down the road because you're taking care of it all at once rather than staggered out over the course of 5 different batches. Now, if you're really diving in and scaling up to 5 gallons and want to go all out, you can get a kegging system. And then for anything that you want to serve, if you want to serve it off tap, even if it's not served sparkling, you can still serve it out of a keg. And packaging day is as simple as racking into the keg. No bottles, no corker, no capper, no knee pain, just right into the keg and you're ready to go. So lastly, you're probably thinking, well, okay, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna scale up. I'm gonna move from 1 gallon to 5 gallons. I love this hobby. I wanna make a ton of homemade booze. What recipe should I start out with? And you're probably thinking that I'm gonna recommend a recipe of my own, but I'm not. Skeeter pea is what I would recommend. Take the sludge at the bottom of primary from one of your 1 gallon batches, slosh that around, pour it into your 5 gallon bucket, and make some skeeter pea. We've got a video on it. It's not my recipe. Got to give credit to Lon for the original recipe. But skeeter pea is the way to go for your first 5 gallon batch because it's easy, it's delicious, everyone loves it, and it comes out to a cost of like 50 cents a bottle on the other end. And so it's stupid cheap also. So if you love lemonade, you love fermented drinks, try skeeter pea as your first 5 gallon batch. I don't think you'll regret it. I know this video was a lot of talking, but I hope you found it helpful. If you did, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming content. And if you're feeling generous, hit me with a tip. You can do a super thanks now to thank us for this content on this channel. Take a look at my ebook, You Can Make Mead. It's got a bunch of 1 gallon recipes that you can easily scale up to 5 gallon brewing. Check it out, it's on my website, doingthemost.org/book. Until next time, happy brewing and cheers.
Homemade brews and various RTs, everything from mead to roast, bake creation, fermentation, inebriation, doing the most.